What if you were hardwired to not care about money? This was something I wondered throughout my teens and 20s, as I was often unable to summon the motivation to go out and make that sweet green.
And now, folks, it's time for Who Do You Trust? Hubba, 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 money, 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 who do you trust?
Now, before you free market enthusiasts start lecturing me about lazy socialists, you should know that when it comes to something I care about, I work longer and harder than anyone else I know.
I'm perpetually disorganized, as you've already seen. I have a tendency to misplace documents, lose files. While we were on lunch, I lost my phone for about 20 minutes. I become increasingly flustered when I have to do paperwork. Now, why is this the case? Well, I'm not entirely clear on it, to be perfectly honest with you, but according to a neurologist who treated me, it has to do with an impairment to my motor cortex, which I've known about since I was about 5 years old. So your motor cortex does more than just control how you move your body. It also controls how you make sense of the physical space around you, including where things belong. All these difficulties made it very hard for me to get work done on time when I was an office clerk. I would have to double check and triple check everything. This is a normal aspect of my career for my entire life. As a result, in that particular job, I would stay late an extra 3 or 4 hours after the end of my shift to make sure everything got done. Now, one day, my boss comes up to me, she takes me aside, and she says I can't do that anymore because they can't afford to pay me for all those extra hours. So I had to either get my work done in the standard workday or I was fired. So can you guess how I handled this?
You got fired.
Well, I did, but that was further along. See, I started by working for free. I would stay late the extra 3 or 4 hours and I would just not log them.
I didn't work for free because I cared about the money, and I didn't do it because I wanted to keep that job. On the contrary, I hated that job. I worked for free because the rest of the team was depending on me. Thinking that I might have let them down kept me up at night. Sometimes I'd cry myself to sleep. In fact, I've got a bit of a bad habit of pushing myself to the point of burnout. Factoring in the time it takes to write the script, record the audio, and then assemble video footage into a coherent narrative, these videos sometimes take as much as 50 hours of work each. I'm often working away well past midnight. I'm quite industrious but completely uninterested in money, and this often resulted in parents, grandparents, and even some friends lecturing me about how my priorities were out of whack. I often tried to make myself care about money, and no matter what I did, it never worked. I began to wish that someone would just put me in an MRI machine and prove once and for all that my brain just didn't light up when I saw pictures of dollar bills. Then, maybe people would leave me alone. It made a kind of sense. Psychopaths are unable to feel concern for the physical or mental well-being of anyone else. Something in their brains just will not allow them to experience those emotions. I have never felt a rush of excitement when I received a paycheck. Acquiring material goods very seldom produces any kind of positive emotion in me. Even though I'm something of a technophile who takes his phone and laptop everywhere he goes, I really don't enjoy shopping for these items. In fact, it's kind of a nuisance. It's something that I do when a device breaks down and I have no other choice, but I won't do it just for fun. So, if psychopaths are incapable of feeling empathy, might there also be people who are incapable of feeling avarice, who simply don't experience that emotion? I began to suspect that I was one such individual. I didn't think I'd ever know for sure, but then I ran across this article. A team of researchers in Germany conducted an experiment in which participants played a game that rewarded them with real money. And they performed fMRI scans to measure brain activity every time a player increased his winnings. There were 24 players in total, 12 artists and 12 non-artists. Now, admittedly, that's a very small sample, which means we have to employ a healthy skepticism until these results can be replicated. But the researchers found that the non-artists displayed heightened activity in the brain's pleasure centers every time they received money. The artists, however, displayed no such neurological activity. As you can probably guess, I fall into the artist camp. Again, I must stress that this was a very small sample, which means these results may not hold up under repeated trials. But we can draw a few conclusions here. Some people experience pleasure from receiving money, others don't. In fact, we can list at least 12 people in each group. The members of the second group, those who do not experience pleasure from financial gain, are not outliers. How do I know that? Well, let's assume that they were. Suppose there were only 1,000 people in this world who did not experience any pleasure from financial gain. If that were the case, then the odds of finding 12 of them in a sample of 24 would be astronomically low. Even if we assume that indifference to money is a quality found exclusively in people with artistic inclinations, the probability that a random sample of 12 artists would be populated entirely by people who did not feel pleasure from financial gain is still incredibly low. From this, we can safely infer that some non-trivial percentage of the human population is completely unmotivated by money. It could be 2%, it could be 5%. It almost certainly isn't a majority. In fact, it's probably not even a large plurality. What makes me say that, you ask? Well, this is conjecture on my part, but I think it's safe to say that if 30 to 40% of the population derived no pleasure from making money, capitalism would have collapsed a long time ago. Why do I keep talking about pleasure? American society, with its puritanical roots, tends to view pleasure as something of a luxury, as something we can do without. You're supposed to just roll up your sleeves and do the hard work regardless of how you feel about it. This attitude often bleeds over into Canada, which is influenced by the United States more than any other nation. It's very different from Europe, where pleasure is viewed as a necessary component of a complete human existence. But as you're about to see, in terms of neuroscience, pleasure and motivation are inextricably linked. This is where people usually make an appeal to willpower. We should be able to do what is expected of us regardless of whether or not we enjoy it. And in the short term, this kind of philosophy works just fine. Most people don't enjoy cleaning their bathroom, but they do it because they understand the necessity of the task. But if you want long-term engagement, then people have to derive some kind of satisfaction from their work. The brain's reward system responds to a neurotransmitter called dopamine, which provides a rush of pleasure and excitement. Dopamine plays a crucial role in motivation. In fact, mice who are deprived of dopamine stop eating until they starve to death. Without a dopamine response in the brain's pleasure centers, it becomes extremely difficult to stay motivated. In fact, there's evidence to suggest that the fatigue and lack of motivation experienced by people with depression is tied to dysfunction in the brain's reward system. Depressed people know that they have to eat, but they often have no appetite. They know that they should go out and exercise, but they just can't seem to find the willpower. Their rational minds insist that it's time to get out of bed, but they just can't seem to move.
See, I started by working for free. I would stay late the extra 3 or 4 hours, and I would just not log them. Well, after several weeks of this, there we go. After several weeks of this, my boss takes me into her office, tells me that I committed a fireable offense, accused me of falsifying payroll statements, and basically implied that I committed fraud. Now, I broke down in tears in front of this woman because I told her that the only reason I was doing it is I didn't want to be the person who dragged down the rest of the team. I wanted to help, I wanted to contribute, and I wanted to make sure things got done on time. She called me dishonest and untrustworthy and sent me on my merry way. Shortly after this, my eyesight began to deteriorate from the keratoconus I mentioned. I was living with constant nausea, dizziness, headaches. It's been corrected to a limited degree, but I still deal with it to some extent. I sank into a deep, dark depression because I couldn't hold on to a job for more than 4 to 6 months. I felt like I was worthless, of no use to anyone, and just a burden. I wanted to die.
If I had to describe my working life in one word, that word would be agony. And it wasn't any one thing that made the experience so painful. It wasn't a demanding boss or an abusive coworker or long hours that led to burnout. It was everything. Every aspect of my day from start to finish. Each one nothing but a shallow cut, but put them all together and they bleed you dry. It was everything I just mentioned and more. The tedious, repetitive work. The inevitable clash with workplace bullies. Abusive customers. The long commutes. Having to fight against my own body clock. And having to hide my revulsion with corporate culture. Its blandness, its sameness, its aversion to anything that might make you think or feel.
Ugh, this party's a dud. Yeah, no kidding. That lady turned off a Hall & Oates song because it was too provocative.
Everyone, let's remember, this is still a workplace.
Here's the thing about doing work that provides you with no sense of satisfaction or accomplishment. You can't keep it up forever. You might be able to force yourself to do it out of a sense of obligation. You might hold on for weeks, or months, or years, but eventually you will crack. I learned that from experience.
The thing is, Bob, it's not that I'm lazy. It's that I just don't care.
Don't care?
It's a problem of motivation, all right? Now, if I work my ass off and Initech ships a few extra units, I don't see another dime. So where's the motivation? And here's something else, Bob. I have 8 different bosses right now.
I beg your pardon?
8 bosses.
8?
8, Bob. So that means that when I make a mistake, I have 8 different people coming by to tell me about it. That's my only real motivation, is not to be hassled. That and the fear of losing my job. But you know, Bob, that'll only make someone work just hard enough not to get fired.
Maybe other people have other anchors. They slog away in a miserable job for their kids, or they do it because they really want to impress the neighbors with that fancy new car, or they do it because women only want men who make lots of money. None of those things ever motivated me. I don't want kids. As long as I'm not directly harming them, I couldn't give 2 fucks what my neighbors think. And I'm just eccentric enough that I have a hard time bonding with 99% of the women I meet. Plus, I'm on the asexual spectrum, so not much of a priority. You might be saying, boring paperwork, horrible bosses, Rich, everybody has to deal with these things. And you'd be right. Hating your job is by no means a rare phenomenon. In fact, a team of researchers in Australia found that people in the lowest quality jobs actually have worse mental health than those who are unemployed. So the question becomes, how can we make working life better for everyone?
This is data from a team of researchers led by Peter Butterworth of the Centre for Mental Health Research at the Australian National University. I'm just going to read you their conclusion. Overall, unemployed respondents had poorer mental health than those who were employed. However, the mental health of those who were unemployed was comparable or superior to those in jobs of the poorest psychosocial quality. This pattern has been evident in prospective models. Those in poorest quality jobs showed greatest decline in mental health, or greater decline in mental health, I should say, than those who were unemployed.
We could start by shortening the work week. And before you say it's preposterous, you should know that there's a company in New Zealand that did just that with fantastic results. Perpetual Guardian, a firm that manages estates, wanted to see what would happen if they reduced the work week from 5 days to 4. After 2 months of studying the effects, supervisors reported that their staff were more creative, more energized, and more motivated. Their attendance improved. They worked more diligently. The staff reported a better work-life balance and greater job satisfaction. Sounds great, right? In fact, Germany is in the process of transitioning to a 28-hour work week. The proposal has been around for a while now. There are many people calling for a shorter work week. But this should raise an interesting question. Just how much can we shorten the work week? If you try to research this topic, you'll find a plethora of people talking about the economic and health benefits of a shorter work week. But you won't find anything that looks like a calculation of just how many man-hours of labor it takes to maintain our standard of living. Let me try to illustrate my point. During the Great Recession, the unemployment rate doubled, and yet there were no noticeable shortages in any staple commodity. Nobody went to the pharmacy to find that they were all out of deodorant or shampoo. those freezers in the grocery store were always fully stocked with microwavable dinners. Best Buy had laptops and video games aplenty. True, fewer people were buying cars, but every dealership had plenty to sell. From the perspective of the consumer, there was no noticeable drop in the availability of any good or service. Hotels kept running with fewer staff. Starbucks remained open. Canadian Tire performed regular maintenance on millions of vehicles. The issue in the Great Recession was whether people could afford these products, not whether companies could produce them with fewer employees. Doesn't that seem weird to you? How could such a drastic shrinkage in the workforce not result in production shortages? So what happened? Did companies just learn how to produce more goods with fewer people? Well, part of it can be accounted for by the fact that people were just spending less money, so companies had to produce and transport fewer goods. But can that account for all of it? I'm honestly asking, I don't know. I'm not here to propose an explanation, I'm here to ask a question. A question that, so far as I can tell, no one else is asking. Simply put, how much work do we have to do? Or more precisely, how many man-hours of labor are necessary to maintain our standard of living? Can we get away with a 25-hour work week? What about a 15-hour work week? Obviously, 40-plus hours isn't necessary to maintain adequate levels of production, or economists wouldn't be recommending that we shorten the work week. Might we improve our standard of living by reducing excess production, thereby giving people more free time and reducing environmental damage? For instance, it's well known that we produce more than enough food for every human being on this planet.
However, in the real world, scarcity is a myth. Every few years, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations puts out a report called the Statistical Yearbook. In 2012's version, they had the following to say regarding the productive potential of global agriculture. The growth of global agriculture's productive potential has so far been more than sufficient to exceed population growth, resulting in a steady, albeit slow, increase in average per capita food availability. For the world as a whole, per capita food availability has risen from about 2,200 kilocalories per person per day in the early 1960s to nearly 2,800 kilocalories per person per day in 2006. While developing countries even recorded a leap from 1,850 kilocalories per person per day to over 2,600. This growth in food availability, in conjunction with improved access to food, helped reduce the percentage of chronically undernourished people in developing countries from 34% in the mid-1970s to just 15% 3 decades later.
Not only do we produce enough food for everyone, in America, 40% of that food goes to waste. There are similar figures for other developed nations. Yes, I know that some of you are going to insist that we need to keep some excess food on reserve in the event of a catastrophe. But when almost half the food we produce ends up in a landfill, I'd say we've gone overboard. And it doesn't stop there. The United States Department of Housing and Urban Development estimates 554,000 homeless Americans at the end of 2017. By contrast, the U.S. Census Bureau estimates 13 million permanently unoccupied houses at the end of 2018's second quarter. Do you see the disparity? We just celebrated Earth Overshoot Day, the date when we've used up all our natural resources for the year. Think of it like a budget. Say you make $3,000 a month. If you use it all up by the 20th, say you splurged on a home theater system or something, well, then you're going to go into debt just to get groceries or fill your car with gas. We're using resources far faster than the Earth can replenish them. We would need 1.7 Earths to maintain our current level of consumption indefinitely, and that's assuming no economic growth whatsoever. I could do an entire video on this topic, and I will at some point. Using the data from the Global Footprint Network, the BBC calculated that if everyone lived like an American, we would need almost 4 Earths. Our problem is overproduction, not underproduction. We need to reduce consumption ASAP. So, shortening the work week? definitely a good thing. And we really should find out just how far we can shorten it. But we shouldn't stop there. Shortening the work week is great, but we should also make the work environment a more pleasant one. In short, we should make work less of a chore and more of a fulfilling experience. So how do we do that? In his book Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us, Dan Pink outlines 3 key requirements for a highly engaged workforce. They are autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy means you control your own work. You make important decisions about how the work gets done. Mastery. The work is challenging enough that you derive a sense of satisfaction from learning to do it well. And finally, purpose means that you believe that in doing the work, you are making a positive contribution to the world. Your work matters. Multiple studies have confirmed that Dan Pink is onto something. This report, published in Work and Occupations, demonstrates that autonomy plays a critical role in employee satisfaction. And I quote, "Within the findings, an overall pattern is clear in that greater levels of both job control and schedule control have the potential to generate significant benefits for the employee, evident in reported well-being. Moreover, the positive effects associated with informal flexibility and working at home offer further support to the suggestion that schedule control is highly valued and important to employees enjoying their work." A similar study in Taiwan measured the impact of job autonomy on people who work in medical clinics. Its conclusions were as follows. For the 1,380 staff members of community health centers, employees with autonomy in both organizational and individual tasks were shown to have positive work outcomes, more work satisfaction, and less intent to transfer or intent to leave. Well, that's all well and good, but if you're a manager, you might be wondering, how do I give my employees more autonomy? Well, you can start by letting go of your ridiculous obsession with sameness and conformity. When my eyesight got bad, I became extremely light sensitive. The bright fluorescent lights in my office were giving me terrible headaches. So I bought a small desk lamp and used that instead of the ceiling lights. Now this is an office that I shared with no one. My choice of dimmer lighting would not affect anybody else's workday, but that didn't stop my supervisor from coming in to scold me. "This is an office, not your private clubhouse." I told her that my light sensitivity was making it very hard to work, but she wouldn't budge. Okay, fine. I turned the ceiling light back on and wore my sunglasses instead. 5 minutes later, she comes in to scold me for violating the dress code. It astounds me that companies justify these policies under the claim that dress codes are necessary to ensure work gets done, and then, when the dress code is impeding somebody's ability to work, they stick to it anyway. That should tell you that it's not about productivity, it's about control. Yes, I know, I could have initiated some legal procedure to get an exemption to the dress code, or to get special accommodations for my office. But the point is, I shouldn't have to. If you're a manager, then you should be empathetic and reasonable enough to make an exception for an employee who is very obviously in pain. And if you can't do that without being compelled to do so by some higher legal authority, then as far as I'm concerned, you're not fit to manage a lemonade stand. Never mind control over our workspace. Maybe you could just give us control over our own goddamn bodies. Did you know that dress codes are contributing to global warming? Yeah, they are. Because the temperature in office buildings is regulated with the expectation that men are going to be wearing long-sleeved shirts, suit jackets, and neckties. And since those clothes are not weather appropriate in the summer months, buildings have to crank up the AC. Meanwhile, the poor women in their sleeveless blouses are all shivering. Mastery is a little more difficult because a lot depends on what your job is. But simply put, we should be automating menial jobs wherever possible. Rather than trying to create jobs or keep people employed, we should celebrate whenever machines alleviate the need for human labor. But the problem is we seem to be automating all the wrong jobs.
This is data from David Autor of MIT. This graph is fairly simple. Each one of these colored curves represents a different decade. Everything above the red line is job growth. Everything below is job losses. On the left-hand side, we have low-skilled, low-paying jobs. And over here on the right, we have high-skilled, high-paying jobs. So what is this graph telling us? Well, if you look at the blue curve, which represents the 1980s, you see a dip in low-skilled, low-wage jobs and growth in high-skilled, high-wage jobs. So great, right? Unfortunately, if you look at the two most recent decades symbolized by the yellow and green lines, you have the exact opposite phenomenon. An explosion in low-skilled, low-wage work, very minor growth or even losses in high-skilled, high-wage work. This is Auteur's research. Figure 5 contributes 3 nuances to the occupational polarization story above. First, the pace of employment gains in low-wage, manual, task-intensive jobs has risen successively across periods. Second, the occupations that are losing employment share appear to be increasingly drawn from higher ranks of the occupational skill distribution. For example, the highest-ranked occupation to lose employment share during the 1980s lay at approximately the 45th percentile of the skill distribution. In the final 2 subperiods, that rank rose still further to above the 75th percentile, suggesting that the locus of displaced middle skill employment is moving into higher skilled territories. Third, growth in high skilled, high wage occupations, those associated with abstract work, decelerated markedly in the 2000s, with no relative growth in the top 2 deciles of the occupational skill distribution during 1999 through 2007, and only a modest recovery from 2007 to 2012. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you that David Auteur is somebody who believes there's always going to be enough jobs for everybody. I happen to disagree with his conclusion, but even if he were correct, what would seem to be indicated here is that the kind of work that will be available to people will be low skill, repetitive, menial, soul-crushing work.
And finally, purpose. A lot of people feel their job is pointless, and they're not wrong. I would submit that the problem is that we're not working to better the lives of our fellow citizens, but instead we're working to make money for a very small group of people who won't share it with us anyway. A shift away from capitalism means reevaluating our most basic understandings of what counts as work and why that work is socially beneficial. But when 85% of us are unhappy with our jobs, we have to do something. Hey, this is Rich, reminding you to check out my fantastic science fiction series, The Justice Keeper Saga. Head over to Amazon.com and pick up a book for just $3.99. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell. Bye!
Runaway train.